Welcome everybody to the Performance and Accountability Board. Welcome to those in the room, watching live online or indeed watching back at a later time. We will start with introductions. I'm Mark Shelford, the elected Avon and Somerset Police and Crime Commissioner. Chief Constable.
I'm Sarah Crew. I'm Chief Constable for Avon and Somerset Police.
Good afternoon, Nikki Watson. I'm Deputy Chief Constable.
And Alice.
Good afternoon, I'm Alice Ripley, the Commissioner's Chief of Staff.
Two of my duties as PCC are to engage with the public and to hold the Chief Constable to account for delivering efficient and effective policing. This board aims to bring together both of those important activities. I want everybody to be able to understand how Avon and Somerset Police are performing. To help everybody do this, there are meeting papers published on my website. This also allows the people of Avon and Somerset to understand how I am performing in my role as the Police and Crime Commissioner. Turning now to agenda item 1. This is about issues raised with me through my contacts, my mailbag, or indeed my engagement with people either on the doorstep or at community meetings. The main issue that we've had from public contact recently, unsurprisingly, is the police precept. This is part of the residents' council tax that funds local policing. This year, the government has allowed PCCs to increase the annual precept by £15 for an average Band D home. I would like to highlight, however, that 2/3 of the homes in Avon and Somerset are in Band A and C, and so the increase will be less than the £15 that for most of you that are watching this. In Avon and Somerset, the money raised through the precept accounts for about 41% of the total of the policing fund. Last week, on the 1st of February, I proposed a maximum precept, which I took to the Police and Crime panel. The panel challenged me on my proposals, but after much discussion and consideration, they approved this increase. This was not an easy decision for any of us to make. We all understand how difficult things are at the moment, given the cost of living crisis. However, without this increase, the police would have had to have made immediate cuts to their workforce, and this would have impacted on their ability to deliver frontline policing services. Ultimately, I made this decision with people's safety in mind. We've had questions from the public on finances, including when I appeared on John Darvill's local radio show. Of the total budget I receive, less than 2% of this fund goes on my office and the commissioning services that I do, such as providing victim support services. However, the rest of the money is delegated to you, Chief Constable. Please, can you explain how that money is spent?
Okay, well, in 2022-23, the year we're in now, you delegated a budget to me of £348.3 million so that I can provide a policing service to the communities of Avon and Somerset. Now, that consists of just under £380 million that we will expend on those services, but that's offset by just over £31 million in income. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about that. Fundamentally, policing is a people business. So the biggest proportion of our expenditure is on people. So that's around 76%, just over 288 million. And that will be obviously on pay, allowances, overtime for police officers, for police staff, for police and community support officers, but it will also incorporate things like medical and pension costs and other costs linked to having employees. So the apprenticeship levy, which we pay back to the government, for example. So the smaller part, the 24%, is what we spend on what we call non-pay. And that includes things that people will understand, like buildings, vehicles, uniform, equipment, IT systems, and all those services in back office that enable our delivery of policing. So that's about 91, just over 91 million pounds in the last financial year. And as I say, it's broken down into a variety of different elements. I did mention income at the beginning of my answer. And I think our communities would want to know what that income is. So we do have income from the private finance investments on some of our buildings. We do get income from speed enforcement and from the road safety courses that are run. We have a very direct grant from the government linked to the uplift in police officer numbers. And there are other very specific issues unique to Avon in Somerset, things like Hinkley Point, where we receive income to deliver a very specific policing service. We do have some partners and some tenants that use our building. So there's rental that comes in income, and also from policing events like football or the Glastonbury Festival. So that's how we spend our money, certainly have done in 2022-23.
In previous years, however, you have spent less than you've budgeted. First, please can you tell us what are the main reasons for these underspends?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we take the last financial year, 2021 to 22, our underspend was 6.6 million. So that's about 2% of our entire budget that year. And there were two main drivers for that. So the first was in relation to police officer and police officer pay. And that was around the timing of our recruitment of new officers, because obviously we recruit throughout the year, but the funding is there and we provision for the whole year. So when we're recruiting at the speed that we are, offset against the number of leavers that we had, none of this is an exact science, we have underspent on officer pay. And we've also underspent over the last couple of years on police staff pay, because we found it to be, as other industries and other sectors are finding, a very challenging recruitment market, particularly in our technical, professional, specialist roles, things like IT or professional services like lawyers, where we found it very difficult to attract people in a very competitive market. Now we're putting things in place to address those things. And the final element in the last financial year was actually an overachievement of income. So each year we project how much income we'll have, but last year was unique because we had events such as the G7 in Cornwall and the COP26 conference in Glasgow, which were very unique and unusual, and they brought in additional income.
Thank you. That was well and simply explained, but I don't want to see any extra money that we raise from the precept going into reserves. So what assurances can you provide me that you will not have a large underspend going forward?
Well, we always forecast, and in this financial year, 22-23, actually our underspend is forecast at 2 million, which is 0.6% of our entire budget. So it's a very small amount. And reflects a much tighter position this year. Now, there are, even within that, there are some over and underspends, and there are some one-off things in there that's actually given us greater income than we expected. And so if we didn't have those things, we'd actually be showing an overspend, the first time for many years this year. And that very unique thing this year was we appealed on some of the costs for our police centres that are funded through that PFI scheme, and we were able to secure and claw back £2.3 million into our finances to spend on policing services. What also gives me confidence is this will be the financial year where we will have achieved our uplift target of police officers. That should happen on the 31st of March. And not only will we achieve our target, we are, in order to achieve the national uplift of 20,000 officers, we expect to exceed by additional 80 officers just for next year. And that means the likelihood of underspends occasioned by recruiting partway through the year will be eliminated to a very large extent. There are still some challenges in the police staff employment market. As I said before, we've done some things. We've reviewed those hard to fill posts, and where we need to fill them, we've looked at things like market supplements to attract the kind of specialist skills that we need. But as you said, we're also looking at a difficult financial picture with inflation. So some of those police staff posts that we haven't been able to fill, we will need to look at very carefully to see whether actually we need to release some of them for savings so that we balance our budget in future years. I'm in complete agreement with you. Reserves are like our own savings at home. Once they're spent, they're spent. And if we spend them, I really want us to be spending them on things that we can invest on a better service for our communities and to achieve better performance later down the line.
Chief Constable, even with this precept increase, we're still predicted a shortfall in funding across the next 5 years. Finally, can you briefly explain your process for identifying further savings whilst maintaining or improving efficiency and effectiveness?
Okay, you're absolutely right, and this is driven largely by the growth we're seeing in our costs occasioned by inflation. So further savings are going to be needed not just in the short term, but into the medium 5-year term as well. And that is going to require us to make some really difficult choices, particularly in the context of an organisation that's already delivered, I think, £90 million worth of savings since 2010 and 11. So delivery of savings is a non-negotiable, and it's actually one of our planning principles. We have, though, as you say, our objective needs not just to be balancing the budget, which we must do, it has to be improving the service we deliver to our communities, and I don't want to lose the opportunity of those additional officers we've recruited to really deliver against the priorities of the police and crime plan. That has to be our focus. So a budget, our savings are a planning principle, they're not an end in themselves. So we have set ourselves a very clear vision for what our organisation should look like, what it should deliver for our communities in 5 years from now. And we are busily planning to achieve that across the next 5 years in the context of those savings. So we will be thinking not just about where we save, but also where we need to invest to improve, but also to deliver further savings down the line, and to give some kind of sense of the things that will be part of our plan, certainly in the short term. Trying to continue to release even more efficiency and productivity for our officers and staff so that they are focused on the things that the public expect them to do. So we will continue on our work of robotic process automation, something that we've led the way in policing. Over the last 3 years, we've released the equivalent of 77 full-time employees by automating processes. I think at the same time, we will need to work with our colleagues in other public services to ensure that the right public service is delivering service when the call comes in from a member of the public. Over recent years, because of stretches and strains, not just within policing, but in other public services, it's felt that sometimes police time is spent doing things that sit outside of our core police mission and divert our energy and resources away. So we will be working really hard in partnership and in collaboration just to make sure that we're working in an integrated way and we're using our skill sets and our powers where they're best directed.
Chief Constable, I just make 2 points. The first is I'm very concerned that at the moment the police seem to be the response force of choice first rather than last. And that has to change. We have to get the balance right so that the police are fighting crime and protecting the most vulnerable rather than picking up pieces for everything else. And I will absolutely support you locally and nationally where I can in order to get that balance right. The other aspect around savings is that very clear view of making sure that we thought about those unintended consequences, because you as a force right now are still suffering from some of the unintended consequences of the previous savings. We used to have an expression in the army, which is God save us from a clever staff officer. So please, please make sure that people think through that because of the issues that it can bring. Okay, I think we'll move on then to item 2, which is a standing item on the agenda, which is tackling disproportionality and racism. The performance report for this quarter covers this topic. So I'd like to talk about what the data shows. It's worth noting that 3 months ago, in the 21 census, the data was released which showed the percentage of the ethnicity of the population. The proportion of people in Avon and Somerset who identify their ethnicity as Asian, Black, mixed or other has increased. This has meant that the constabulary is now further away from its target being representative for the community it serves. And that was a priority when I came in to post. We can see that you have struggled to increase the number of Black people who work for the force. What are you doing to make Avon and Somerset Police a place where Black people want to come and work and stay working?
So recruitment within our Black communities has been difficult. In actual numbers, we have increased, but as you say, population has changed. So the percentages are not in our favour, and that is despite lots and lots of work over many years. But we're still not as close, not even close to where we'd like to be in achieving the representative workforce that we aspire to. In terms of activity, we have committed to delivering against the National Police Race Action Plan, something that is a very recent development. And we've developed a programme of work under an Assistant Chief Constable to support this. And one of the key commitments within the plan is representation, a police service that is representative of Black people and supports its Black officers and staff and volunteers. Now, there are a number of ways that we are seeking to achieve that, and I think that the first and foremost one is we need to create an environment where Black people want to join and then stay, and to do that we've got to attend to our internal culture. And we're working really hard here in Avon in Somerset on creating an inclusive culture which is welcoming to everyone and where individuals feel that they can come and stay and make a career and thrive. You know, some of the work streams happening there are Inclusive Policing with Confidence programme, which has connected with over 3,000 officers and staff on the front line now. We've created safe spaces for difficult conversations to happen with staff and supervisors, for people to be able to raise concerns about their lived experience and to be heard and to build empathy amongst the workforce. We held a really popular and really impactful Race Matters Week in Black History Month in October. We had some keynote speakers from policing and without policing who spoke of their experiences, all very high levels of engagement. We're going to be a pilot force for a College of Policing training package as part of the action plan on Black history. The national plan has run a workforce survey amongst Black colleagues. Those findings are now available down to force level, so we'll be looking at those to see what more we can do. And we've been making pragmatic steps to show how much we're supporting our staff when it is a sad fact that those colleagues who are visibly different often receive more abuse from members of the public. And so we've revised our offering when that happens about how we tackle that and how we support those people in our workforce. So that's our internal culture. But having done that, we do need to reach out and help people with no connection to policing to want to come in. So our diverse outreach team has been incredibly active in the attraction and the recruitment efforts. They run roadshows and events in our communities to highlight the work we do, to kind of reach out to those people who might not have considered us as an employer of choice. They run monthly discovery workshops so people can come along, find more out, talk about the roles, police staff, police officers, back office, front office that are available within the police. There are a range of different events linking into networks and gatherings in the community. So Somali men and women coffee mornings on a monthly basis. We also work with job centres, so where people are identified as having an interest in policing, connecting the outreach team to them to help them along. And we actually bring people in as well to have conversations with the hiring managers that are putting the jobs out, so there can be a discussion and a dialogue, is it right for me? And we're also, with a forensic gaze, this is something we've done before, in fact we've done several times, but is looking at our recruitment process at each step to look at the drop-off. One of the benefits of having the National Uplift Programme for police officers has been it's given lots of insights into what works and what doesn't work on recruitment, and we can learn from that. And I guess the last element that we need to think about, and this is what communities tell us, it's not just about coming into the police, it's knowing that you can progress and you're going to be supported. So we have internally established mentoring and reverse mentoring programs. I'm part of that scheme myself. I'll be presenting for a CPD event later this week. We've introduced positive action programs to help people approach promotion boards and interview selection panels. We know nationally that there are disproportionate outcomes and experiences within complaints and misconduct proceedings for black officers and staff. We've been an icebreaker, if you like, nationally by actually bringing in and recruiting people with lived experience to come and help us in the professional standards department work our way through those complaints to make sure we're driving out any bias in our thinking, even if it's implicit. And I know this is something we share, Commissioner, but we do have a leadership academy which is growing in strength in Avon and Somerset. I've long said publicly that I'd like to see a black chief officer and a black officer and member of staff at every rank and grade beneath, and I think the leadership academy offer that we're developing applied with positive action can be a route to help us achieve that. So those are the things we're doing in three different areas, though I think there's also a reality, and we might come to it later in the questions you want to answer to me. We also need to tackle disproportionality in our service delivery, in how the community experiences us, because these two things are interrelated. If we have disproportionate outcomes in the use of our powers, people are less likely to want to come into policing and be attracted into it.
Thank you. I mean, let's cut to the chase of what the people on the ground are saying. If we turn to the use of police powers such as stop and search, the new census data means disproportionality has decreased. However, black people still face the most disproportionate use of police powers in comparison to other groups. If black people are better represented in Avon and Somerset, will this help reduce the disproportionality in the service that you deliver?
I think it will help, but I don't think alone it will achieve it. As I've said, there are other issues in our service delivery that we need to tackle. We have got multiple strands of work in place to try and tackle disproportionality per se. And for the Chief Constable, this is right at the very top of my priority list. When we talk about performance, that's what performance means for me. Yes, on race, but also on gender and other forms of difference too. And so this is the intent that has sat behind me volunteering to lead the cross criminal justice system identifying disproportionality recommendations, which you've championed, Commissioner. And at the same time, it's why I'm championing the local work within it of the National Police Race Action Plan. And it also sits behind why I've placed culture change and rebuilding confidence front and centre of my focus and my discussion, if you like, with the organisation and communities. I do think it involves changing hearts and minds internally and externally. It really needs to be something that's not just ticked off in an action plan, but something that is felt and believed in the lived experience of our colleagues who are different and our communities as well. And it's taken many decades to get where we are. And I do think it will, I wouldn't be credible if I said it will take 12 months to achieve, but I do think we're making a good start. We're having the uncomfortable conversations that come with issues like race. We're exposing the problems, we're developing solutions. And I think we're laying the foundations for a better future. And it's something that I want to make real, radical, systemic, and I think sustainable change around whilst I'm the Chief Constable. Even though I think it'll take time, it doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be pursued with urgency, importance and vigour, and that's exactly what we're doing. I can say that the constabulary's work, specifically the constabulary's work on those two important documents, the Police Race Action Plan, the Tackling Disproportionality work, as well as incorporating some learning of some really high profile critical incidents that we've had in Avon and Somerset that people watching this broadcast will know in their mind's eye. The work that's coming out of that is developing incredibly well. It's developing at pace. It's very innovative, and I'm hoping that in the coming months I'm going to be able to come to you, Commissioner, with some very strong and impressive proposals, and to put those before our communities too, to try out, to pilot, and if they work, to successfully implement force-wide. And I think they'll have a profound change within the constabulary, but also within our communities as well. And I hope that will then pave way for the cross criminal justice work that we've embarked upon as well.
Yes, and Chief Constable, I am, as you know, the chair of the Local Criminal Justice Board, and therefore I do see this in the round, and I'm enormously grateful that you have agreed to chair this particular subgroup in order to try and connect up all of those recommendations, both those within the constabulary, which you are working at pace, and I can see those being delivered, and I'm pleased, but also to encourage our partners within the rest of the criminal justice continuum to make sure that they are working with that same vigour. And I'm not sure they are right now. And anything you can do to lean in to that, to encourage that same sense of urgency, I think is very important. So let's move on now, if we may, to the third agenda point, which is performance. The first half of the performance report looks at the contribution of Avon and Somerset Police against the national policing priorities. The second half of the report is about how Avon and Somerset Police have performed against the Police and Crime Plan. This time, its focus is priority 4 in the plan, which is increasing the legitimacy of and public confidence in police and the criminal justice system. Just exactly what we were talking about before. At this board in November, I said I'd come back to discuss your people survey in order to give you time to understand the results. And we can see that the results peaked in 2020. Chief Constable, can you please tell me some of the key things that you are doing to increase the morale of your people and improve frontline leadership?
Well, the survey is really important to us. We've got 5 years worth of data now. I do think 2020 might have been unique because of the pandemic. And we've seen steady progress across, but it's a hugely important way of engaging, listening, responding to the concerns of the workforce. Our people are, for me, as Chief Constable, the most important asset I've got. And it's really important I know what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and that I'm listening to that. Now, it's true to say that the survey responses in some areas have taken a slight step. We're much better than we were in 2018. 2020 aside, there's a slight step back in some areas, but that isn't uniform across the different directorates and departments of the constabulary, nor is it in all of the thematic areas. There are some increases in some areas, which I may touch upon in a moment, and there are some decreases in other areas that we need to understand. And it's worth saying that the results themselves are not standalone. They're built in a way that the analysis can happen at a team level, and we do ask our senior leaders to work hard to understand, to do follow-up, to have focus groups, to understand what's driving the outcomes, to develop a plan. And actually the draft action plan brought together, collated for the force, is due for sign off at the end of February. So it's not something that happens once a year. This is a cyclical process of understanding, responding, and then reviewing again next year. But you asked me the question, what am I doing to increase morale and improve frontline leadership? I think we're doing a great deal on those fronts, and I think those will pay dividends in the months and years ahead. So if I kind of quickly step through those things, well, from June to September, our busiest time of the year, we did something new. We did something called talk time, and the chief officer team and the senior leadership team, we undertook 33 different engagement sessions, connected with 800 people, visiting all four corners of Avon and Somerset to meet with officers and staff and to hear firsthand about their hopes and fears, what mattered to them, to share our vision and plans and discuss areas for improvement. The feedback we received was fantastic because people appreciated, I think, the time to connect, especially after the pandemic, but also building trust and confidence between leadership and the front line and getting a clearer sense of direction. And that was one of the positives and improvements out of the survey, was the chief officer team have a clear sense of direction and vision for the force. All of this came on the back of something called the gift of time, which thankfully with your support I was able to recognise the fantastic work and efforts people put in over the 2 years of the pandemic. What we learned from those two engagements was something that we followed up with something we called leadership time just before Christmas, and I know you were present at one of those. We ran 7 sessions for all of our leaders, so everyone in the organisation, probably 800 people who lead others, came together for what I'd say was an inspiring day of leadership development, team building, forward planning. And again, the feedback for that has been very, very strong. It's helped galvanise teams around a shared vision. And I think for me as chief, that was my first opportunity to connect in a very physical way with the whole leadership population together and to share the vision and the strategy. And to lift people's eyes to the next 5 years, to that 5-year planning horizon, and to kind of have some really meaningful conversations about the culture and the way of working that is needed for that 5-year vision. Now, so those are events where we've invested our time, but behind that we continue to invest heavily, and we've engaged with experts to grow and enhance the Leadership Academy, which I mentioned before. We've launched a new digital platform for that very recently. So we can now support hundreds of people, and when we say leaders, we mean everyone's a leader in policing. So there are different levels through digital, face-to-face, collaborative, self-directed learning to help them become better leaders, to plan their leadership journey. Things like leading high-performing teams, well-being, practical people management, a whole host of other areas as well. And through that academy, they can also access leadership programs offered by the College of Policing and through apprenticeships into academic and other sectors as well. We will continue to invest, and we have been working again with some specialists externally on co-creating a target leadership model, and one of the first products of that will be a defined first line leadership programme, which the curriculum for which we are just finalising and building now, and I think that will be a significant tactical intervention and support on our leadership journey, and that in itself will build morale. I mean, the final area to mention is we've also looked to invest in our internal communications and engagement, as well as within that reward and recognition. I think in this day and age, our people demand much more innovative, direct and effective communications. And so we're going to power that up with video communication, events, engagement activities, which are a bit more immediate, and reward and recognition, so that so not only do the messages connect as we go on our journey to improvement, but also people feel valued and appreciated at every step of the way. As chief, my people, as I say, are my most valuable asset, and that's where, aside from our culture, most of my focus exists.
And Chief Constable, I completely agree with you on those aspects, particularly those aspects of leadership, because you get that right at junior leadership level. If you get that right, everything else falls into place. And getting people together around that, enhance that buy-in is also so important to take them on that journey. And certainly from my visit to the College of Policing, discussing this aspect of the work that you are doing, it certainly ties up with the national direction of travel. So thank you for leading nationally on this. It's very important, and I'm looking forward to seeing the output from that course. Secondly, those leadership days, I did enjoy my time with you. I was particularly impressed with the output to the Dragon's Den set of pieces, and I look forward to seeing those actually come to reality, because of they were very innovative and produced some agile suggestions, which I thought was great. I'm jolly glad I didn't have to do the Dragon's Den though. Anyway, let's move on. A very serious subject, and you know, one that I take, I'm always concerned about, and that's drugs. We spoke 6 months ago about fewer recorded drug trafficking offences not being a good thing. And this should increase with greater proactive policing. We're all about preventing crime, and therefore this is something that we should be doing. We can see in the current report that this has continued to decline, while the number of drug disruptions has continued to increase, going in the opposite direction. Can you explain why these two performance measures have continued to move in opposite directions?
Commissioner, as you know, Nikki as DEP drives performance on a monthly basis, and I know this is something that she has been driving through the Constabulary Management Board, so I'm going to let Nikki answer this question.
Yes, well, I'll start with the disruptions first of all. And as you know, we've been running a number of dedicated operations, Operation Scorpion, some of the county lines intensification weeks, and the disruptions, if I deal with those first of all, often come as a result. They're achieved during those days where we disrupt those involved. They're not crimes, and they're often very different to drug trafficking offences. So because we've been running those operations, we have been achieving the disruptions. But if I turn to drug supply offences, so the lower level ones, as you have said, are continuing to decline and have been for about the last 18 months. So we've looked really carefully at why this is happening, and we absolutely believe it's predominantly due to our capacity to conduct those smaller scale proactive interventions with the public. We've been managing quite high summer demand over this last summer period, And we've also needed to repurpose our op remedy resources that we often use for those proactive activities to support our investigations into serious crime for the last 12 months. So reduced capacity for those proactive interventions has resulted in a decline in those drug supply lower level offences. In support of that, we've also seen a reduction in drug possession offences, which is an indication that we're not doing as many stop searches. And if you look at the figures, our stop search interventions have also reduced. And I think that's definitely a combination of the increased capacity that we're dealing with, non-crime, the Chief Constable mentioned it earlier, some of the work with partners, but also just managing the demand that's coming through to us. But also combine that with the fact that we have been growing our organisation very rapidly. We have a large number of new members of staff, which is fantastic, but it takes time to build up their experience, their confidence and their skill levels. And that's absolutely what we're doing at the moment, to try and get them to a confident position where our numbers of stop searches can start to increase slightly, appropriately. But also, in addition, we are repurposing, and from the beginning of January, we repurposed our operation remedy resources. Because of the uplift, we've been able to put those resources back onto their core business, which is proactive activity. They often work alongside those young officers that I've talked about, that increasing their skills, so that they are now back up working as we would expect them to, and what they were designed to do. In addition to that, we also have a dedicated county lines team that deal with the more complex supply investigations, and quite often those are not just drug trafficking, important as it is, but they often pick up human trafficking, the need to support very vulnerable victims. Quite often the cases involve large quantities of drugs, and they can take months to investigate and work with CPS through to the sort of prosecution stage, and they quite often involve large numbers of offenders. So we are dealing with a number of those. I would certainly point out that we're considered leaders in the Southwest in respect to those really complex high-level investigations. There was an investigation recently in Bath where we absolutely got what we call upstream, dealing with the management, as it were, of these drug trafficking sort of rings of people. So effectively, it's the wider impact that we need to have. And we obviously need to deal with all levels of drug supply. The lower level, I think we're in a position to now start doing a lot more of that, but we need to continue tackling those sort of upstream members of drug trafficking organisations.
Well, you've been talking mainly about enforcement, and I'm very pleased to hear that. It's important, and that proactive activity that those local police officers can achieve is significant, as well as the remedy piece, but also supporting the national plan around those three pillars, which enforcement is one, world-class treatment is another, and that prevention of the young getting involved in drugs is the third aspect. And that I actually think is really key to all of this, and we need to work together with our partners to try and achieve better outcomes for our young, because we have to protect our young from these people who just seem to do terrible things to them and trap them into a society which they don't need to be in, and we need to protect them from that. Linked to this is robbery. The data shows that Avon and Somerset consistently has a higher robbery rate than the most similar group of forces. My team has looked into this and can see that the robbery rate in Bristol is 4 times higher than the rest of Avon and Somerset. How are you trying to tackle this problem, particularly in Bristol? And then, when are we going to start seeing an improvement?
Okay, Well, I will take this question as well. So I can say the force is absolutely committed to reducing violent crime and robbery. It's an area of concern and it remains a real focus for us. So between years 20 and 22, robbery did actually fall by 6%, and offences involving knives fell by 13%. But specifically, you asked about Bristol. The robbery rates in Bristol are fairly stable. Over the last 12 months, we saw 6 offences more than 12 months previous to that. So we've been working using our op remedy teams together with our neighbourhood policing teams that work locally in communities to be really perpetrator focused. So there was one perpetrator alone in the Bristol city centre area that had committed 11 robbery offences. So we worked really closely with our colleagues in the Crown Prosecution Service to prosecute those offences, and they are going through at the moment. But in addition to that, we've been working with the antisocial behaviour team, pursuing civil orders against not only that individual, but that individual's associates and people that they hang out with. And we have seen a significant disruption of this group that will definitely reduce robberies. But that focuses very much on personal robbery. There's also business robbery, and we are really robust, and we record business robbery absolutely along the lines of the Home Office guidance and the way it should be reported. So, for example, if you had a shoplifting offence where a security guard was assaulted during that offence, we would record that correctly as a robbery. But there may be other forces that might interpret it slightly differently and might then record the same offence as a shoplifting and an assault separately. So I think that explains why we have slightly perhaps higher numbers of robbery than some of our neighbouring areas. I also think it's worth remembering that obviously Bristol is one of the core UK cities, and it would be very appropriate to compare the robbery levels and rates in Bristol with other cities. We are still slightly higher, 1.5 crimes per thousand in the city, but there are certainly other cities that are far higher than we are in Bristol. But we need to absolutely continue the focus and the priority as we are doing. We have Operation Remedy, who own, certainly if there's a series of robberies, they own that investigation so that we've got the best investigators working them through. And we continue to be perpetrator focused. So we work really closely with partners in integrated offender management, making sure that we're dealing with those high harm offenders, but also working with partners in the nighttime economy, designing out those locations where those types of crimes regularly might take place. We work with our violence reduction units very much with local authorities around intervening early to reduce violence, particularly of younger age group. And we focus absolutely on at-risk groups of escalating offenders, trying to bring those robbery numbers down. So I would say robbery is quite a seasonal crime, particularly personal robbery. With the warmer weather coming, we will be working really closely, educating young people to keep them safe, but also really proactively targeting those that might commit robbery offences. We will conduct plainclothes operations with our Operation Remedy staff and our neighbourhood teams as we move into the summer period.
You mentioned the nighttime economy. 2 Saturdays in January I went out with the street passers, one in Bristol, and then another weekend I went out with the Bath ones. And the constant line from both of them was, please can the local police officers interact with them, because they're a font of good intelligence. They know what's going on, they know where the areas are of concern, but they felt that interaction had been lacking somewhat. The second thing is a bit about business crime, particularly shoplifting. We really need to make it easier for them to report. because if you imagine a small businessman, at the end of the day, he's got thousands and thousands of things to do, he's knackered, and if we make it difficult for them to report shoplifting, difficult to upload their CCTV, they just will never report. And this is something, of course, we want everybody to report crime, always, and particularly businesses. So please focus on making it easier for them to do so. Right, now having given you a bit of an ear bashing, I'm going to hand over to my deputy, Alice, to pick up the next piece.
Thank you. So the Commissioner touched on the use of police powers earlier in terms of disproportionality. I wanted to ask about effectiveness and legitimacy, in particular of stop and search. So we can see that the data shows that 29% of stop searches result in some sort of positive outcome. And I guess the question is, do you think that this level of positive outcomes justifies the use of this power? Is this good enough?
So I'll take this one. As I said before, disproportionality is top of my priority, so I want to talk to this question. The find rate and the positive outcome rate in Avon and Somerset has actually risen, respectively, by 3.1 and 2.4% in the last year, and that is in the context of a reduction in the overall number of stop and searches taking place. So that's suggestive to me of a more focused and appropriate use of power. It's a start though, and we do need to go further. I think it's really important to remember that the primary purpose of stop and search is to enable officers to confirm or allay suspicions about individuals without exercising their power of arrest. The threshold, reasonable grounds to suspect, is the same to conduct a stop and search and to carry out an arrest. So in that context, we may not have found anything relevant in 71% of cases, but we have avoided multiple unnecessary and unjustified arrests as well, which I think is an important consideration that's sometimes left out of the debate. But I think stop and search is a really important tactic. Used well and used legitimately, it helps us keep communities safe, which I think is something everyone wants. Whatever the community, that's what people tell me they want. And it also can do so, used well, without bringing people into police custody, as I've said. But what is the most important measure of success on stop and search is not whether you find anything or not. I think it's, is it done lawfully? Is it done in a procedurally just way? How does it leave the person on the other end feeling? How does it look to the community? Because it only takes one illegitimate search, whether it's got a positive outcome or not, to shatter public confidence, undermining it. And overlaid on this is disproportionality in the use of stop and search, and indeed other police powers. That's a really real concern, because without justification for being disproportionate, which I haven't yet been able to find, and I don't think there's evidence for it yet, that does undermine procedural justice, and it does threaten the legitimacy. So whilst the latest census figures, I'm pleased to say, have shown an improving position, disproportionality for stop and search, the difference between white and black or minoritized communities is slightly closer together. There's still a huge amount for us to do. Now, it's been recognised by academics, by the Independent Office of Police Complaints, I think even by the HMIC FRS in previous inspections, that there is a difference on disproportionality between what they call intelligence-led searches, where the searches are based on recent and relevant intelligence. They're more successful in terms of find rate, but they're more likely to feel procedurally just. The difference is with those that are kind of more on the spot, spontaneous, what's called officer-led searches. And I think that's the area where we need to actively consider our options. And within that work I alluded to before, the work on the tackling disproportionality and the National Police Action Plan in Avon and Somerset, that's where some of our proposals are looking at different options for how we do officer-led stop and search.
if I recall correctly, that's where you said that you're hoping to come to the Commission with proposals within the next few months.
Yeah, we're working to April.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions on that?
No, thank you.
Okay, so we'd now like to move to complaints. And to start off, I wondered if you could please explain the process as briefly as possible for our watchers, our audience.
I oversee the complaints process in the constabulary, so I will answer this question. So I would certainly start by saying that the police service has one of the most accessible, transparent complaint processes in being. So there are a number of ways that members of the public can express their dissatisfaction on the service that they've received. They can either do it directly with local officers or staff, local to where they work, local in the local stations, and those officers and staff, if it is of the appropriate type of complaint, can deal with it locally and resolve the issue very quickly after the member of the public has reported it. If that early resolution is not possible, or perhaps it relates to something more serious, then a member of the public can make a complaint directly into our central professional standards department. And the professional standards department will assess that complaint. They'll obviously record it immediately, and they'll consider whether it merits a mandatory referral to the independent police complaints body, the IOPC. And actually, there's a number of occasions where we voluntarily refer things, even if they're not mandatory, to the IOPC, and that is to provide transparency and to try and allay community concerns. So once that complaint has been received and lodged, then there are a number of ways that it can be investigated. Sometimes the IOPC will take them as an independent investigation and will either investigate themselves or get an independent police force to investigate it. Sometimes they'll look at it and they'll come back and they'll say, no, Avon Somerset, you can deal with that yourself and investigate it. So the important part is that the outcomes that are possible from a complaint made by the public are a number, and they include that the service was acceptable, that the service was not acceptable, that the investigation is not able to confirm either way, that the matter is resolved or there's no further action. And what's very important, whoever investigates it, is that all interested parties are updated with the outcomes of the investigation and the finalisation of that complaint. Now, if a member of the public is not happy with that outcome, then there is the process where an appeal can be lodged, and that can be lodged either by yourselves in the Office of the Police Crime Commissioner or with the independent IOPC body.
Thank you. So turning to those reviews then, the reviews that come into, specifically the reviews that come into the Commissioner's office, we can see that about a fifth of these are upheld, which means that the PCC's office has assessed that they haven't been handled to a satisfactory standard. Are you comfortable with this level? And how are you improving the complaints handling process to address some of the common themes that are found in those reviews?
Well, our objective would be to satisfy the member of the public making a complaint on every occasion. That's what we would seek to achieve. So, as I mentioned in my previous answer, a number of the complaints are managed locally by local staff, and that would tend to normally be a police inspector on a local area. We have new people coming into those roles all the time, and we try and upskill them and give them the skills that they need to effectively manage and deal with complaints and support complainants. But clearly we probably haven't got that right on every occasion, and that has likely led to the reviews and the fact that some of them have been upheld. So we need to manage that. I'm not satisfied with that number. So we have been holding a series of groups where we're upskilling those officers, those very officers. The last ones that we held were in October and November last year. And from now on, we will be holding them biannually. And the purpose of those is to get small groups of officers together so they can get input into new information or perhaps changes in procedures, but they can learn from each other. They can learn good practice as well as sort of training and upskilling. We've also arranged for an input from the IOPC around the way we should properly investigate a complaint and keep complainants updated, and that's taking place later this month. So I've got the desire to continually drive up standards, and I have also then introduced what's called an organisational learning meeting. It's actually been in place for a while now, where we share the key issues that are causing a problem or that are causing perhaps a complaint not to be upheld, the key problem with that investigation. And we're making sure that we disseminate that learning to the wider organisation and those new inspectors that are coming into position and then having to start dealing with complaints themselves. So not there yet, work to do, but it's definitely a focus.
Well, one of the things that I have discovered when I'm reading these complaints is that rarely, if ever, have the police deliberately done something wrong that the public are concerned about. It tends to be clumsy activity by the police, and it tends to not keeping the public informed of the progress. That's the thing that they really, really get excited about, that they understand there are processes and procedures, but they just need somebody to tell them where they are along the road of one of these inquiries or investigations. And if you could do that with those teaching lessons, that would go a long way, I think, to try and resolve some of these.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think that concludes your past chief stuff. Yeah. Okay, so we'll now move on to the final area, which is areas of further discussion. And this perhaps is the most important area that has been raised recently. When we held this meeting in November, it was on the same day as the Inspectorate, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary Fire Rescue Services, had released their report on inspections of vetting, misconduct, misogyny, and public service. Only a few weeks ago, we saw another awful and disgusting case of a serving police officer, David Carrick from the Met, who had committed a horrendous series of crimes over 2 decades. It seems to me that the system just doesn't work. This should never have been allowed to happen. And I'd like to ask some specific questions around those recommendations in that national report. So the first is a number of recommendations talk about adverse information. Can you explain what adverse information means? And then can you tell me how you identify, record, and act on this information?
Okay, so I'm going to answer this question, and adverse information is a phrase that covers a multitude of things. I'm going to try and explain it. So there's a national approved practice that all police services need to comply with, and in Neighbour Somerset we definitely do, and it explains adverse information as including untested allegations, previous police attention, which perhaps haven't developed into anything further, adverse judicial findings, that's not just criminal, could be financial, discipline outcomes, live discipline matters, so something that's currently still being investigated, or live criminal proceedings, and then criminal convictions, cautions, or penalty notices. But it can also include intelligence or information, and this could be reported by members of the public or other serving officers or police staff colleagues. So the intelligence or information could relate to behaviour which is just not in keeping with the values of Avon and Somerset Police. So it could be anything. So so that's adverse information. But in addition to that definition and it coming in our being reported or in our systems, it can also be identified through our vetting processes, which could be recorded on the vetting system, or potentially it could be recorded in our counter-corruption systems. So, for example, if somebody had an associate of concern, that would definitely be recorded in our counter-corruption, and we would notify it as an associate of concern report. Then we also have a internal integrity reporting line, which any of our members of staff or police officers can use anonymously if they feel the need, and they ring up and they report information or anything that they're worried about in relation to a colleague. So that information would be risk assessed. We have certain registers. We definitely have a sexual misconduct risk register with anybody with any concern that we have about anybody in that respect would go on to that register. And then there could be circumstances where we legitimately carry out an investigation. So sometimes information is just one piece of information, there's nothing else to support it. Could be anonymised, maybe we can't corroborate it with anything else. Then what we might do is a risk mitigation strategy. So we would put some monitoring in place, and we would monitor other things that individual member of staff is doing to make a better assessment of whether there's anything that we should be concerned about. And it's all of that work is overseen by a detective chief inspector who works within our professional standards department.
The previous Chief Constable referred to this as picking up the vapour trails behind people, because people who have misbehaved in whatever way leave a trail. And I certainly from my background, I know this, and it's important that people just don't turn a blind eye to it. Once it's been reported, it's recorded, and then it's acted on in a fair and proportionate way to the individual. Recommendation 15 is about changes in personal circumstances. Again, trying to spot early indications and risk factors. As well as the personal duty to self-report, I see from your written response that this relies on supervisors and leaders asking questions in appraisals or when people move roles. Do you think your leaders do this in a sufficiently robust way?
So we, I think the Chief mentioned, we held over the end of the autumn period some leadership times where we had every single member of police staff and police officer leader from the whole organisation through a number of those leadership times with the chief officer team, and we definitely reinforced the importance of this at those forums. So absolutely everybody in the organisation who's a leader understands the importance of this. But it's not just our leaders, that we don't just rely on our leaders, important as that is. We have some fail-safe mechanisms as well. So there are quite a few ways where we can either review vetting or we can complete health checks on members of staff where they have a change in circumstance. So, for example, if somebody changes some of their information on our system, such as a change of address, you know, there could be a proactive follow-up to investigate, you know, why that might be, particularly if there were other reasons that gave us cause for concern. There will be times when officers and staff are re-vetted, so that everybody would be re-vetted following a misconduct outcome. Potentially, if you had a promotion or a change in role, that would trigger a revetting. It happens at several points. And then there are also regular revettings during your service, and the frequency of those are being reviewed nationally following the cases that you've previously referenced. Seeing it, the importance of it, the thing about perhaps doing a vetting is that is a snapshot in time, and we need to be very vigilant and conscious all the time, as you talked about, those vapor trails. So we are pressing our staff to understand that. There is a new approved professional practice in relation to vetting currently being written and reviewed. It's due to be published at the end of February, I believe. We should be looking at that very carefully and making sure that we are completely compliant with that. And we'll continue the sort of the continuous improvement screening of officers, and by that I mean that every officer, every member of staff in the constabulary will be checked through the police national database to make sure there's nothing that's happened elsewhere in the country that we're not aware of that hasn't been reported to us. Just leaving no stone unturned, really, to make sure that we know everything about all of our members of staff.
I understand there has been some difficulty accessing that national database. Has that been fixed now?
So if every force in the country will be doing this, and if every force in the country logged on at the same time, the system would crash. So the way that it's being managed is every force is supplying their data, and there is a central body that's sequencing the forces through checks through that system. We will then be sent back the results to action.
So is it an advantage that our force starts with the letter A? Are we at the top of that list?
They haven't told us how they're going to prioritise, but I understand it's going to happen quickly.
Well, let's hope it's alphabetically. Okay, moving on. Recommendation 25 is about police conducting thorough inquiries into improper behaviour, particularly focused on data readily available through the force IT systems. Can you give some examples of how you used that information from our own systems, and are you confident that all the relevant information is used as part of this inquiry?
Yes, well, the recommendation is that we would routinely carry out all reasonable wider inquiries if you're doing an investigation into these type of allegations, and we have been doing that for some time. So the examples we would give is if somebody was under investigation, it clearly depends on what the allegation was about, but a number of things that we would do. We would definitely look at the use of our own IT systems, and we have a number of those. We could look at their work mobile devices, because most officers and staff will have different types of devices, not just desktops. We can look at body-worn video recordings, and of course we can look at radio communications, location checks, the way that the officers use and staff use our systems. So we have incorporated these into our investigative inquiries, and we've been doing so for some time. Perhaps I can give you a couple of examples. So we had one where there was some concern about the way that a member of staff was conducting stop searches of the public. So we reviewed covertly all of the body-worn video of a number of stop searches, not just the one complained about, just to have a look at the approach, the manner, the style, what the officer was doing. We also looked at our crime recording system to see where the records of those stop searches were recorded and to see what was being recorded. We looked at and checked the radio airwave data and locations and the reasons that the officer was giving for the searches, not just for the one that was complained about. And as a result of all of that, on that particular case, we were able to reassure ourselves that the stop search had been done correctly. But the second case I was going to talk about was a case that actually resulted in an accelerated hearing where an officer was dismissed. And this was following some IT based inquiries into our systems and computers that the officer was using, we could see that the officer was typing unacceptable language in the description of what he was putting into the computer, and that wasn't appropriate, and the officer ended up losing their job.
I mean, this is really an incredibly important subject, and it's a subject that we need to get to the bottom of. We need to be comfortable that we've got a baseline that we can work from and then move forward into efficient and effective policing. But we can't get there until this retrospective work has been done and checked. How close do you think you are? And I'm really going to point this at the Chief Constable to being able to say that we have cracked this work.
I think there's always more that you can do. No matter all the things that we do, and we do a lot here, and we're doing a lot more, and our ambition is very strong to ensure the complete integrity. My career has been spent being a detective, and I'm a natural cynic. I think we've always got to be looking for more and not being complacent. I'm sure the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police at some stage would have said they were confident, and I don't want to make myself look silly later down the line. I think we just have to be very, very vigilant and continue to press and to see if we can do more and more and more and more within the realms of human rights, of course, but more and more. If the public haven't got confidence in the integrity of their police force, then our model of policing is lost. So nothing could be more important.
Yeah, I get that. The issue that for me is that getting that balance right. Now, I'm delighted that Avon and Somerset in this instance is so risk averse. And I know I constantly have a go at you for being risk averse, but in this instance I think it is appropriate that you are. But I would like to make sure that we get to a position where we have completed those recommendations as laid out in the report to the best of our ability, and that the workforce internally knows that piece is done and these are the standards and that's the way we're going, and we're all going ahead to police and to prevent crime. And I think that internal piece and that internal communications is very important for that morale of those frontline police officers and the remaining police staff. Okay, let's move on to a broader note of misconduct. And Chief Constable, you are the commanding officer of Avon and Somerset. Ultimately, this is your responsibility for culture and discipline, and I'm fully supportive of that. It has been reported that there are many cases, even when officers have been found guilty of misconduct, that they continue to work in policing. And I've personally been sent a number of examples of this, of concerns from the public. Chief Constable, can you please describe the range of behaviours that may constitute misconduct?
Okay, so we have, well, there could be no lack of clarity for what these are, but the standards of professional behaviour and the code of ethics, and between them they set out 10 behaviours which are core, and from day one of becoming a police officer, working in policing, these are non-negotiable. So if I go through them very briefly: honesty and integrity, that says what it is on the tin. Officers must act with honesty and integrity on all occasions, on duty or off. It's non-negotiable. Then there's authority, respect and courtesy, and that's really talking about acting with self-control, with tolerance, with respect, with courtesy, not abusing powers, which we've seen in some of these cases. Thirdly, equality and diversity. Now that's about acting with fairness and impartiality, but it's also about not discriminating unlawfully or unfairly. Use of force. A power that we have, it can only be used to the extent it's necessary, proportionate and reasonable in the circumstances. Orders and instructions are another standard, and this requires police officers to abide by police regulations, by force policies, by lawful orders. Another is duties and responsibilities, and that's all about being diligent in the exercise of duties and responsibilities. Another, confidentiality. So this is about treating the very sensitive information that you have as police officers with respect, not disclosing it, not accessing inappropriately, not accessing it inappropriately. Fitness for duty, that requires all police officers to make sure they are fit for duty when they come on to carry out their responsibilities. Moving to the last couple, discreditable conduct. Now, police officers must behave in a manner that does not discredit the police service or undermine public confidence in it. And that applies to in all aspects of life, on duty or off duty. And that requires some recording of things like a fixed penalty notice, for instance. That would again trigger a vetting exercise. And finally, and this is important, it goes to what you were saying, Commissioner, challenging and reporting improper conduct. That's a standard of all its own. Police officers must report, challenge, act against the conduct of others that may have fallen below the standards of professional behaviour, the 9 that have gone before. So that gives a positive responsibility. If you see something, or if you sniff that vapour trail, you do need to report something and do something.
So why, just in simple terms, because we're getting close to the end now, why is it that there are still officers serving who have been disciplined for misconduct and still serving?
Well, briefly, I'll explain the process and then come to what I think my answer is. So whenever there's an allegation or a suspicion that there's been misconduct, an investigation takes place to say, has it? And what's the seriousness of it? At the end of that investigation, there is then a determination. Is there a case to answer? And is it misconduct or is it gross misconduct? Gross misconduct is the type of misconduct which is of such a standard that it would justify the dismissal of the officer responsible. In most cases, that will lead to a public hearing with an independent legally qualified chair, a police superintendent and a layperson, but led by the chair. There are some cases, and Nikki referred to it as accelerated hearing, where a chief constable hears that case, and that's because it's deemed that the evidence is strong, even incontrovertible, and it's in the public interest that that officer is dismissed as soon as possible. Now, when gross misconduct hearings happen, irrespective of who the chair is, there are two possible outcomes, well, three. The case isn't found, or if a case to answer is found and they're found for gross misconduct, it's either dismissal or a written warning. Now, if sometimes officers can resign, it's allowed, as long as they've served their notice, but even then they can come before a hearing. And the sanction on that occasion would have been dismissed, and they do receive their name going onto a list that means they can't work in policing again. Now, there are some very strict guidance, very well thought out guidance produced by the College of Policing that leads a decision maker, a chair, in a gross misconduct hearing to a final outcome and a sanction. So that's, as I say, the sanction could be gross dismissal or final written warning. Now, I believe from looking at it and being involved in this and chairing quite a number of those hearings now, that actually the threshold of stuff that I'm seeing is at the right level, gross misconduct. I think the problem and the challenge comes when chairs determine that it's gross misconduct and it's found and it's proven, but they don't dismiss. That makes it very difficult to manage the risk of that individual in the organisation. On many times, as Nikki said, that will trigger a vetting review, and the person may not be able to actually do the job that they're doing because their vetting doesn't allow them to do it, but they're still in the organisation. So I think the level is set at the right level. It's the decision taken on what the sanction is that really needs to be considered. Now, I've looked at all of the hearings that have been, the gross misconduct hearings that have happened over the last 5 years, and in all of those chaired by a chief constable, there has been an outcome of dismissal, or would have been dismissed had they still been serving. But there have been several cases over that time where there have been, when the panel has been chaired by an independent, where a written warning is a sanction. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong in the circumstances, I'm not judging. However, you asked the question of how these things can happen. That's how they can do, and it is challenging sometimes in some of those cases to be able to redeploy that officer and manage the risk that they pose. It does, as Nikki said, call for a different kind of strategy within our counter-corruption unit than to, in your words, following the vapor trail still.
Well, I'm not going to ask you today, but I will ask you to come back at one of our future public accountability boards, performance and accountability boards, to look at the numbers of those officers who are still serving in Avon and Somerset, to be able to give the public some confidence about that level and what those sorts of activities and safety has been put around them and the public. We're pretty well at the end of the meeting, so thank you, Chief Constable, Deputy Chief Constable and my Chief of Staff for your input and putting it together. Thank you also for everybody behind the camera who's made this happen and the work that you put in putting this together. We're going to change this because of what you said, you asked, and we're going to then make it a monthly meeting, but just for half an hour each time. And our next broadcast will take place on 9th of March at 16:15, 4:15 in the afternoon. So thank you all for watching, and I look forward to meeting up with you next time.